Hark! It's an 87th Precinct podcast. This is the only podcast in the world dedicated to Ed McBain's seminal series of police procedurals, which began in 1956 with Cop Hater and ended in 2005 with Fiddlers. There were 55 books in the series, and today's podcast looks at book number 41, Lullaby. My name is Paul Abbott, and to review this book I'm joined by Mr. Stephen Royston.
Hello.
And Mr. Morgan Brown.
Hello there.
And guess what? We're still doing these as remote recordings because we are currently in our second lockdown of the year. Having had a brief window where we weren't quite in lockdown, then we were in a tiered system, and now we're back in lockdown again. So, you know, there's all sorts going on. So I hope wherever you are listening to this, you're at least safe and well. I went off to have a test as part of the citywide test system today. So if it sounds like I've got a sore throat, it's not because I've got COVID, it's because I had to rub my tonsils with a little thing, and it's made me feel a bit funny.
Yeah, it's not very pleasant, is it? I had mine on Saturday. It's a bit of a peculiar sensation, to say the least.
Yeah. And you have to also stick it up your nose, which made my eyes water, so I did leave the testing centre looking like I was really upset. So, any road. So, as usual, you can find us on all the social things as Hark87 Podcast, the username, or you can visit ko-fi.com/Hark87 if you want to buy us a virtual coffee. And many thanks to any of those of you who've already done that, which is very much appreciated. And if you'd like to, please leave us a rating or review wherever you're listening. That said, let us get on with the joy, sunshine and merriment that is the year 1989 and the book Lullaby. A lot of fun coming up here.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 1989 as a year, we'll get a bit of contextual stuff out the way before we get into what McBain was up to. 1989 as a year, in some ways, is actually probably one of the most interesting ones that we've come to out of everything we've talked about since 1956, really. I was 11 years old, you two were 10 years old, so we've reached double figures for our contemporary selves back in the day. Not that we were reading Lullaby, I don't think, back then.
Morgan might have been.
Well, he could have been, couldn't he? Well, can you remember when you first read what you considered to be an adult book?
Probably around 1989, actually. My first adult-ish book that I read was definitely Stephen King's Carrie.
Yeah.
And I think I probably read The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty around the same time. I didn't really get into crime fiction until a good few years later, though. But by sort of 10, 11-ish, I was avidly devouring any horror I could get my mitts on.
Yeah. What about you, Steve-O?
God, I'm the foggiest. I can't remember.
No.
Certainly not that young. No, don't think so.
I remember that basically because I read so much back then and went through all my books and went to the library a lot, I started reading books I'd find around at home. And I remember starting to read thrillers that my dad would be reading. And I remember reading Arthur Haley Overload, and I definitely read that before we left Scarborough. So that's pre-1990, which is not a book that any 10, 11-year-old should be reading, given how much sex is in it. Sex, every single page, sex with every sort of person, between every sort of people, and then a plot about some electric company. So that was quite an eye-opener. Yeah. So, but no crime fiction in 1989. Probably still mainly interested in fighting fantasy game books. So.
Well, yeah, that was definitely a theme for me as well at the time, I'm sure.
Yeah. I've only got a couple of notes of what goes on in 1989 because realistically I started looking through it and it's like, well, there's so much here and I couldn't possibly address everything. However, I think it's worth mentioning that on the 20th of January 1989, George H.W. Bush is sworn in as the 41st President of the United States of America.
Okay, yeah.
And not to be satirical or topical at all, but he was he the last single-term president before Donald J. Trump?
He was indeed, yeah.
Indeed he was, yeah.
Oh, imagine the embarrassment of that. How terrible.
At least he didn't whinge about it, did he?
No. He was a little bit more sensible about it, let's say. Anyway, what else have we got? Oh, February of 1989, there's the fatwa that goes on Salman Rushdie for his book, The Satanic Verses, which I've never read.
Nor have I, actually. I've read quite a bit of Rushdie, but never actually read that one.
I think it was one of those things, it was such a big news story that suddenly everyone knew who Salman Rushdie was, even if you were a kid.
Yeah, like his well, is it notoriety or his fame far exceeds anybody's knowledge or reading of his works, I would say, certainly.
Yeah, he was, because he'd have turned up on all of the news programmes. He was on Spitting Image and things like that sort of satirical puppet show that's sort of come back this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so everyone knew who he was, and so...
He's slightly unusual looking guy as well, wasn't he? So I suppose...
For Spitting Image purposes, definitely, there was something that they could turn into a caricature, wasn't there? Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Someone who is now much more famous than he was at the time, though, in March of 1989, Tim Berners-Lee puts forward his proposal document for what ultimately becomes the World Wide Web, which is allowing us to do this remotely here via the power of... that humanity is harnessed purely for good. Oh, dear.
That must have got going fairly quickly then. If that was 1989, within 10 years it was...
Essentially, yeah.
Quite quick.
I mean, it was more or less universal within 10 years of that. And because it wasn't like there wasn't computer-to-computer connections by that point, because there'd obviously been all sorts before then.
Yeah.
But yeah, he set down the framework for what was actually the web rather than just computer-to-computer communication. And then the only other thing I thought I'd mention, and it is something that happened 31 years ago today.
Today, that was the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It certainly was. Yeah. So when you're talking about years that have something very significant in them, there's little I think we've had in our lifetimes quite as symbolic as the fall of the Berlin Wall, really.
No. Well, we were there, I suppose, 10 years ago.
Of course, yeah.
In the rain, God, getting really wet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Getting really hopeful of the scorpions turning up.
Scorpions were going to be there. No scorpions at all. Bon Jovi miming.
Yeah. We got teased with the beginning of Wind of Change, didn't we?
Oh, the choir.
Yeah. So it was both a high point and a low point. But yeah, that was 10 years ago, blimey.
Crikey.
Wow, so you two got that very special experience of missing the scorpions.
Yeah, that was good, yeah. So Gorbachev, he was there, and Lech Wales, yeah. Various other luminaries.
I Spy ex-communist leaders.
Yeah,
a few of them, yeah.
You tick them off in your little collector's guide.
I think Gordon Burns. Gordon Burns was there.
Presenting a special edition of the Krypton Factor with Lech Wałęsa.
Yeah, can he get over the death strip without the death
in
strip?
on those one-piece tracksuits that they must wear.
Yeah. No, Gordon Brown, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, there we go. People who don't know about the Krypton Factor and Gordon Burns will not have a clue what that was, but I can assure you it was very funny. Anyway, right, so yeah, it's a big year, 1989. It's quite a big year for Evan Hunter, Ed McBain as well. So I'll just go through, before we get onto Lullaby, what was happening in the world of McBain, because I've got quite a lot to mention here. The books that come out in 1988, a year that we've skipped, there was no new 87th Precinct book in 88, but there was McBain's Ladies, the Women of the 87th Precinct, the little compilation of stories based on the female characters in the books. And there was another one of those in 1989 called McBain's Ladies 2, TOO. I've not got either of those, so I don't know exactly what is in them.
I think I've got the first one. It is just excerpts from the novels, as far as I recall. I don't think there's anything specially written for it. It's just sort of chapters that feature the female characters. I think possibly stung by criticism of his female characters. It's a bit of a sort of slap back to those critics. And entertaining enough, but not necessarily essential.
No, I don't list them as, within the canon of the books by any means, but there are 2 compilations, McBain's Ladies. And it's funny, actually, you mentioning that. I think you're probably right. He probably was like, do you know what? I'm getting fed up with people telling me I don't write women well. Can we put something out? So they come out, I think, probably only in paperback. And the odd thing is, though, his female character writing's probably getting much better from here on in. So the period he'd been looking back on, it's not his best.
No.
But from here on in, it gets quite good. Anyway, there's 2 of those. You also have a Matthew Hope novel in 1988, The House That Jack Built. We have Lullaby, obviously, in 89. And we also have the novel Downtown, which is a standalone McBain novel, which is set at Christmas. I have got that on my shelf. I haven't read it yet. But that's the other thing that comes out in 1989. And TV adaptation-wise, on the 26th of June 1989, should you be sitting down to watch television in Japan, you could see Tanin no Kankai. I'm assuming that's how I pronounce it. This is the anglicised version of the Japanese name, which I believe is an adaptation in 4 45-minute parts of Goldilocks, the first Matthew Hope novel. So we're about to get into a period where we're going to get loads more Japanese adaptations of McBain stuff. But yeah, so apparently there's like 4 lots of 45 minutes. That's quite a big adaptation, really. So
certainly is, yeah.
Yeah, but there's absolutely no way I'm ever going to be able to find a copy of it or know anything about it. So, but it did happen. Outside, though, of books and publishing and adaptations, 1989 is the year that Evan Hunter has his first heart attack. So we're getting into the period now where health is going to be something we're going to end up mentioning probably more often than we'd like to.
How old is he in 1989?
He's 63.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop him writing, at any point. So he has his first heart attack and he has angioplasty which is a treatment for it, isn't it? I think that's how they widen the blood vessels. And, yeah, but it is the start of illness starting to become sadly more common in his life than he would ever have wanted. Apparently that's when he gave up smoking. He had this heart attack, but I reckon he must have been trying to give up smoking because we've been talking about Maya, haven't we, in these books?
Yeah.
And even this one as well, talking about trying to give up cigarettes by switching to cigars or giving them up completely and things like that. Clearly, the heart attack was the thing that finally got him to cut down from the 2 packs a day that apparently he was smoking. So, but even more stuff from 1989, or by 1989. 2 things that happened in 1988, in fact, are Herb Alexander, who was his first agent at Pocket Books. Obviously, he was with an agency himself, Scott Meredith, but when he got to Pocket Books, who published the paperback of Blackboard Jungle and then ultimately published the first 87th Precinct books. So we've got Herb Alexander to thank for commissioning Evan Hunter for those first 3 87th Precinct books to try and fill the gap that they thought was going to come from, the Perry Mason books from Earl Stanley Gardner. Not that Earl Stanley Gardner actually gave up writing; he kept writing for years after that. But yeah, it was Herb Alexander who made the connection between a manuscript that had been submitted under a pseudonym and Evan Hunter, and invited him to lunch, had the chat, said, "Would you like to write a series?" And Hunter went away and came up with the 87th Precinct. So, but sadly, he dies in 1988. And someone else who dies in 1988, I told you it's all laughter and fun and merriment, is Hamish Hamilton himself.
Oh, wow.
His UK publisher. Even though Jamie Hamish Hamilton, who I talked about way back in Like Love, he'd been his publisher since then, but he hadn't been working at that publishing firm. He dies in 1988, and he was such a big character in the world of publishing. What did I get on here? There's a little note in this obituary I found. Hamilton regarded publishing as a wholly personal occupation. His flair for finding manuscripts and enthusiasm for the authors he took under his wing made it an adventure to be on his list. So I think he was a proper old school, character. Because Because if you remember, one of the things I mentioned when we first talked about Hamish Hamilton was that he was a man supposedly of intense friendship and also intense hatred for his enemies. And would famously not enter a room if someone he didn't like was in there already. So
that's quite, a bit of a character then.
Yeah, he was mates with Raymond Chandler. And also, I mentioned back in Light Love as well, he was also befriended by Vince, the ferocious warehouse manager with whom he went on serious drinking sprees whenever he was in London. So every time you think a character in the books is larger than life, you have to think that these are the people that these authors are mixing with.
Yeah.
With all that out of the way, we can get towards Lullaby. Whew. Right. Book 41. Copyright 31st of January 1989, so it's coming out very early in the year anyway. It's now the first US hardback edition in William Morrow & Co., so it's a new publisher in 1989 for the American books, although the paperback stays in Avon Books. This is the last Hamish Hamilton release, which I think is just coincidental to Mr. Hamish Hamilton's death. But I wonder if perhaps when they were renegotiating, maybe Evan Hunter didn't feel like he had a personal connection there anymore or something. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe.
That would make sense, yeah.
It's also the last paperback to come out in Pan. So Pan, who have served us so well for so long, this is our last Pan paperback in the UK.
Dear me.
And within his archives, it mentions the manuscript for Lullabies in there, a final original, a rough edition, and then it has like 4 little stories mentioned that are sort of extracted from it. But I don't think these were ever put anywhere else, although they could have been. One's called Eggs for Breakfast. One's called Eileen Screaming. One's called Family Dispute, and one's called Party Talk. And I think I can pin all them down to actually bits within this book.
Yeah.
Especially that Eggs for Breakfast one, which is a particular scene in the book I like quite a lot. And get the dedication out of the way. It's for Julian and Dorothy Pace. I couldn't find out much information about them, except that Julian Pace appears as one of those sorts of characters in some of the books, as the Julian Pace Elementary School in the book Romance.
Oh, right.
And it's mentioned as well in Kiss later on as well. So it's another... this book is stuffed full, I'm sure, of mates of McBain's being used for the names of things.
Yeah, I think they're neighbours, do you think?
Yeah, neighbours, friends. Yeah. As usual. Have you two read this before? Because this was my first time.
Yes, I have, yeah.
I had read it before as well, yes.
Okay, so can I ask you guys what your initial thoughts are on it? So I come to it as the Lullaby virgin this time then.
I think I pretty much nearly always say this, but I had virtually zero memory of this plot until like kind of getting towards the end, and then it kind of all I remembered exactly what had transpired. But yeah, when I picked it off the bookshelf again to read it, I took a brief look at the back, but I generally don't, and I just start reading. And it just kind of interweaved onwards, and with very little coming back into my head initially. Similar to the last entry, or maybe even the last few, in terms of quite a lot going on again. I would say it's one of those. Yeah. He seems to have, for the last, whether it's quite half a dozen or so, but he seems to be a bit of a run with plots with a lot more plates spinning than he perhaps previously had.
Yeah.
So yeah, they've been my initial thoughts without going too far.
What about you, Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. My recollection of it is sort of a bit wrapped up in my recollection of the next two in the series, just because the edition I've got is an omnibus edition of Lullaby, Vespers, and Widows.
Oh, right.
So I've initially just read straight through them all in one kind of fell swoop, and so in my head they're all kind of a bit of a piece of this sort of trilogy of fairly kind of bleak, kind of quite dark toned kind of entries in the series. That's kind of mainly what I'd remembered about it. And I think that some dark elements in there which do bear out that memory as well.
In typical McBain style, if you hear that the title of the book is Lullaby, you can sort of work straight away, figure out something that's going to happen in the book, can't you? Even if you've no idea, you know it's going to have something to do with, probably a baby or a child at some point. And then it's not, the term lullaby hasn't got quite as many possible other uses as, say, ice or tricks has, or something like that. But he does use it a couple of times to represent different things, doesn't he? Like a lullaby to mean killing someone.
Yeah, because one of the main stories in this, the drug story, doesn't really have anything to do with lullaby, does it?
No, I think he just gives one of the characters just says the lines, sing him his lullaby or something.
Yeah. So it kind of applies to half of the book, or 2/3 maybe.
Yeah. I've made one main note here, which is this story is like a Columbo episode smashed into an episode of Breaking Bad. It's like just mashed together.
Columbo, why there's no machine involved, is there, that he has to work out?
No, there isn't.
It's all about timelines, though, so I'll give you that, actually, which is obviously a big trope of Columbo, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. That's what I was thinking. There's a bit of who was where when type stuff.
Which quite amusingly Andy Parker puts them onto, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Like a throwaway comment.
Yeah, in the one, you only really get one scene of like the whole squad together. And that's where Parker gets to make a little quip about sobriety or something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in the overview, clearly the story is about a dead baby, a dead babysitter on the one hand, a situation with drugs, delivery, gangs, setups. That's a piece I found very complicated. And then also you've got the personal story of Eileen, who is now going to see someone in the sort of psychiatric therapist part of the police department, essentially, to talk about what happened in the last book and what's happened to her in the past, and her relationship with Bert Kling, which is now on a purely, sort of friendship level, let's say. They've moved apart. And so that's a very interesting thing that's woven through it in there anyway.
Yep.
I don't know what to say about this one. It was my first time with it, and it's got at least one sequence in it that I think is one of the worst things he's put in any of his books. Which is when, we'll get to it when we get to it. But essentially we start as always with a crime scene, and this time it is quite, it's a horrible thing because it is a tiny baby and a babysitter who've been killed at New Year's Eve. You've got, the usual mechanism of that kicking in, and because there's a burglary as well, isn't there?
Well, that's what links the other major plot to it, yeah. So there's a burglary that they find out was committed on exactly the same night in the flat above or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or two. Which
same apartment block.
Yeah. Is that a coincidence or is it not? And they don't know for quite a while. So that's what sets them off with that plot line, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or is it not Bert coming across the assault? Or does that happen coincidentally?
That's separate. So you've got Willis, who's apparently investigating this burglary in this.
Oh, of course it's separate. Yeah. So you got three things, haven't you?
Yeah, but So because you've got a burglary with violence in this block of flats, they're obviously going to off chasing after this person, thinking he might be related to the person who's done the murders in the block of flats. They solve these crimes, but obviously for the actual finding out who does the murders, the chasing down the burglar, it doesn't end up helping.
No.
So, but this is the police work. This is the procedural bit, isn't it?
Yeah. Quite a lengthy kind of red herring, maybe. Well, not some red herring, but.
But the thing that really dominates this book more than that story even, or those stories, is this drugs and gangs thing, which is interesting in the sense that it's McBain trying to reflect the changing face of the crime in the city. We've got sort of different makeup of the ethnic groups who are involved in this now, particularly the Jamaican gangs in this one and the Chinese gangs, which I'm sure reflected what was happening at the time in New York and other cities as well, and the rise of, cocaine as the major drug. But it's such a big... Could somebody try and explain what happens in that? Because I was going over it again and trying to get it in my head. And
it's quite a weird structure of a book, really, because he does loads about obviously the homicides are committed before the book starts, and so it kind of opens with that, and then it does shift its focus, doesn't it, onto the drug story for the majority of the middle, really, and then obviously with the fairly dramatic end to all that. But they're fairly unusual bedfellows, aren't they, those two plots, really? Totally kind of different kind of tone, if you see what I mean. Yeah, I can try and explain. So there's in a nutshell, so yeah, we randomly get onto this through Berkling, don't we, who sees a man being assaulted by 3 Jamaicans with baseball bats, and he saves this guy. He ends up arresting 2 of them, doesn't he, or 3 of them maybe. Ends up saving this guy, who then tells him to go to hell because he didn't want saving. I can't remember what his name is. Somebody Herrera, isn't he?
Jose Herrera, yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit of a... yeah, he's been around the block quite a few times. A bit of a kind of a fairly slippery kind of guy, I would say, isn't he?
That's fair to say.
And so obviously he is then trying to kind of make Kling feel bad almost for saving him, and then he gets this idea suddenly that he can get police protection in exchange for providing details of this drugs shipment that's arriving in the docks, of which he knows fairly sketchy details. And so the rest of the plot involves the mechanics of this drugs deal, which you learn little bit by little bit from his narrative and the story, and kind of what he's been up to and what his relationship with this Jamaican gang is. And you don't really get to the bottom of that till quite late in the book, and then you get it from the perspective of the Jamaican gang as well. And then later in the book you get it from the perspective of the Chinese gang, because what it seems like in simplistic terms is the Jamaicans have hired this Herrera guy as a pretend go-between in order to set up the Chinese gang, in order to have an excuse for legitimately coming in on their drug shipment, I think.
Yeah, something like that, isn't it?
That's more or less it. It's really complicated.
Yeah, well, I think it's so complicated because you only get a little bit of information by a little bit, and they're quite spread out, and you almost start forgetting what you've understood about that plot line by the time you get another little bit as well. But I think that's possibly intentional, because all those 3 parties, the Chinese gang, the Jamaican gang, and Herrera, only know a little bit of the story themselves each, don't they? And they're all looking to put one all over the others, and therefore they don't quite know the picture. So I think as you as a reader are similarly a little bit in the dark, well, a lot in the dark, until the end when it all gets resolved in one way.
Yes, a very dramatic fashion. But of course, there's also the 2 Chinese brothers who sort of are working as hired hands for one gang or the other gang, and it looks like they're double crossing or triple crossing. And
well, I'm fairly certain by the end they end up actually successfully working for all 3, don't they? Yeah,
I think so, yeah.
It doesn't end well for 2 of those 3 parties, should we say? Perhaps we shouldn't ruin, otherwise that's a fairly dramatic ending. It kind of doesn't matter who's going to come out on top in that. They're all fairly disagreeable entities, aren't they?
Yeah, that's my Breaking Bad sort of simile. Simile, that's not quite the right. Comparison is that sort of thing.
And so the police are in the dark, you and the reader are in the dark, the three separate gangs are in the dark, and well, apart from one who susses it out towards the end. But yeah, it has quite a bit in there about the mechanics of like the 80s drug trade from South America, doesn't it? And distribution through the US, which is, would be fairly topical, very topical in those days, I would think.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so you got all that going on whilst you've got a fair, very personal family homicide running in parallel as well. And the burglary, although the burglary gets resolved. Yeah.
I mean, what I was interested in as well is, and perhaps Morgan can offer some thoughts on this, is McBain's use of, so we know that McBain's use of dialogue is generally brilliant. What I'm concerned about in this book is his use of writing in the voices of these different ethnicities. How did you find that?
Yeah, it's uncomfortable, isn't it? I was thinking that as I went along. It's just something that I can kind of forgive it a bit more when it's happening when you're reading it in a novel from the 50s. By 1989, I could definitely be living without it. I can read someone writing in Jamaican patois if they're Jamaican. If they're Ed McBain, not so much, and indeed, like the Chinese characters that he gives this sort of horribly kind of the voices he gives to them, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't really remember him doing it much before. It's a bit of a weird thing to suddenly start doing, isn't it?
You get the odd bit of it in some of the early ones, but it's not all that often. And he seems to do it a lot in this particular novel for some reason. Yeah,
but he also does it with like the German prostitutes as well. It's just like totally ridiculous. But some of it, like the with the Chinese hitmen, it's like some of those passages were unreadable because you just can't read it without kind of saying it out loud to yourself. And then it's just absurd. It was fairly daft, that,
it's very strange to read. I sort of understand the idea that he's trying to get across the idea of these gangs being so rooted in their own ethnic groups that they have these attitudes towards each other anyway. So, the sort of racism between that. But it you don't need to do L's and R's swapping round in Chinese speak.
I can understand maybe a little bit, like the beginning when he introduces the Jamaican characters, and quite not everyone might not know, the pronunciation in their accent, and therefore I can understand there may be a bit of and so and so would be sound like so and so, but you could literally put that in a few words, couldn't you? And you've got your head round it. But there's really no excuse for going on like that for them, nor is there any excuse really for having to explain what a Chinese person speaking English with a heavy Chinese accent sounds like. Yeah. It's like unnecessary, really.
Yeah, there's much better ways to handle it.
Or what German people sound like speaking with a thick German, speaking English with a thick German accent.
Yeah, well, the two German characters to which you're alluding feature in one of my least favourite scenes that I've ever read in one of the 87th Precinct books, which just seems needlessly pornographic.
Yeah, it was very strange. That didn't really serve any purpose whatsoever, other than
no, because all that's happening is the Jamaican gang leader is talking to his deputy, let's say, and that's all it is. They're discussing something and coming to a conclusion that they're going to kill more people than they thought originally. You're going to have to kill Kling or something like that. You don't need to do it in the middle of a sex party just for the sake of writing this dirty sex party. It's graphic and it's pornographic in a way that he rarely strays to that level of sort of sex detail.
He's done it a few times before. I think sometimes he can't help himself, can he? Dirty old man period. I don't think. I think it's just one of his. But yeah, more lengthy certainly in that passage than previous.
Yeah, but having said that, then this book also contains what I reckon is. I mentioned before this extracted story called Eggs for Breakfast. I reckon that's the scene where there's two burglars just talking in a diner together.
Oh, yeah.
And that is an absolutely brilliant little scene. It's a little mini scene in an interesting setting with two characters with a certain perspective, which could have been something out of Pulp Fiction. You know, it's that sort of dialogue.
Yeah.
It's got that sort of Elmo Leonard-y kind of dialogue going on, hasn't it? It's great in that respect. So, yeah, I really like it.
Discussing cholesterol levels in eggs and things like that. So, you know, it has got some really, really good stuff in there. But yeah, I mean, I'll mention one or two references as well in the book that crop up. There's a very obvious reference to the birds.
Oh, yeah.
There's talk about Halloween. Well, it's still days behind. A Hitchcock season where he mentions that including the birds.
Yeah, couldn't resist it.
Yeah, and we've also got, there's loads of names in here as well. There's reference back to Roger Haviland at one point.
Don't we find out what Monroe Monaghan's first name is? Do we find that they're called Michael?
Oh, is that, one of them's called Michael, yes. And that's the only name we ever get for any of them. So that's a little bit of extra information. It's a shock to themselves, isn't it? But yeah, there's also an interesting bit where Fat Ollie turns up and starts moaning about immigrants writing books and changing their names, which is the most self-referential we've had for quite some time, I think. Who else have we got? Yeah, there's two ships they're trying to track down to try and figure out who the father of this adopted baby is. And both of these ships, one's called the Roy Edwin Dean and one's called the Edward Lazarus Kalin. They're both people from Sarasota that McBain knew.
Of course they are.
There's a reference to a place called Bowdoin Bluff, which is a reference to the writer Ed Bowdoin. Bowdoin, I'm probably saying that terribly wrong. Sorry, Ed Bowdoin. There's also a reference to a film called Prizzy's Honour. Have you ever heard of Prizzy's Honour?
Prizzy's Honour, yeah, I've heard of it. I don't think I've ever seen it, though.
No. It's written by a guy called Richard Condon, but not Dick Condon, who was the police guy that was the friend of McBain, just to be confusing. This is about a film based on a book, which also features the actor Robert Loggia, who was the first on-screen Corella. So whether that was in McBain's head or not, I don't know. It's So as usual, there's stuff you can dig out of this as well for the research purposes. If like me, you're finding it quite hard to follow in any other respect. And I will say, Steve-O, you mentioned that there wasn't any gadgets or devices in this Columbo style.
But there is, yeah. Not that they're involved in the solving of the crime, though.
No.
But yeah, there is a gadget.
There's this thing called a TDD machine, which is what Teddy Corella uses to message Steve Corella when he's at work. But it's like text speak, which is amazing. So writing this stuff on their little machine, which then broadcasts it to Steve Carella's machine. And the way they do it is like they use shortened versions of words and stuff. And it's just like Steve and Teddy doing sort of cutesy text speak to each other. So that was interesting anyway. Yeah. Anyway, right. If we don't start wrapping this up soon, we'll be here forever. The plot I described as the Columbo plot is the one with the baby and the babysitter who's been murdered. And to remain vaguely, spoiler free, that plays out a bit like a Columbo or an Agatha Christie in a way in terms of motivation for it, and is a little bit disappointing how it suddenly comes to a conclusion with characters you've not really had in it before, which is how I find some of those golden era detective novels sometimes a bit disappointing.
I found that really, really far-fetched, the way that they investigated that as well, because like right from the outset they were trying to find out like the adopted baby's parents before they'd I'm sure that in any walk of life there would be way more probability that the intended murder victim had been the girl. And it just didn't ring true that they kind of almost paid lip service to her in half-heartedly tracking down her boyfriend who only a few months before said he was going to kill her. And yet made massive, long investigations into finding out who a few-week-old baby's biological parents were. And so it just seemed quite far-fetched from the outset, that, and got even more far-fetched as it went on, really.
But it does at least treat us to the fact that when we get to the point that we discover that someone was having an affair with this babysitter who was only 16, it drives Maya completely, or Maya, I should say. I keep pronouncing that wrong. Maya completely insane. He turns Maya into this swearing maniac. He's really annoyed with this guy.
Yeah. It's a classic... I mentioned Andy Parker before, because they basically can't work out when there was any opportunity. They get onto him, and Maya says, well, you shouldn't accept the testimony of a drunk, basically.
Yeah.
And it gets them to think, oh, maybe he's right, and they go back and shake him down, don't they?
Yeah. And somehow, luckily, find someone who's overheard a phone conversation. That always felt a bit like...
That was handy, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and could recall it very clearly, despite the fact that it was a New Year's Eve party at some stupid time in the morning when everyone would be completely steaming.
Yeah.
Right, as we get towards summing up, unless there's anything we need to mention, I should say this book features the first appearance of a character we're going to see quite a lot of, which is Assistant District Attorney Nellie Brand.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Who comes in to conduct the sort of Q&A and... lead the actual legal investigation with Corella and Maya in this one. And so she will be in it for almost every book now, I think, until the end.
Fantastic.
Save one or two. So he's up in the cast of regular female characters in here as well, which is a good thing, I think. Anyway, so there's that. Shall we have some contemporary reviews and then give our own summing up?
Oh, why not?
So Marilyn Stacio reviewed it in the New York Times in February of 1989. Nothing sloppy about his style. Even after 40 novels in this series, Mr. McBain still delivers a story without fidgeting, like someone who knows the law's on his side. True, he hasn't curbed his penchant for describing women as animals, but neither does he compromise Eileen Burke in a subplot that has a detective reliving her violent rape she suffered in Tricks. So overall, Marilyn's... happy with that one, anyway. Jean M. White in the Washington Post says, the amazing thing is after 40 books spanning more than 3 decades, an Ed McBain 87th Precinct police procedural still can be exciting, absorbing and surprising. And then goes on to sort of give a little plot overview and focuses in a bit on Kling's terrible love life. Matthew Cody in The Guardian. Oh, it's a short one, this one. Why does Intruder kill both babysitter and babe? Boys from 87th Precinct explore undergrowth of adoption laws. One tiresome subplot centres on drug running. A second, more arresting, tracks raped woman cops, sessions with psychiatrist. Dialogue orchestration is masterly. Yeah, so that was pithy.
Yeah.
It's perhaps not that wide of the mark, though.
No, it's not unfair.
No. John Welcome in the Irish Times. There are plenty of practitioners about in the police procedural field, but Ed McBain, who was one of the first, if in fact not the original, remains the best. It's formula writing, of course, but since he virtually invented the formula, he is entitled to persist with it, as he does to great effect in his latest instalment. So, going down well in the Irish Times there. Marcel Berlin's in the Times likes it. Now, this is the one I was saving up for. I mentioned this on our Twitter feed a few weeks ago. John Coleman in the Sunday Times on the 28th of May 1989 reviewed the book thus. Lullaby by Ed McBain, Hamish Hamilton, 1295. If you like formulaic stories in which cruelty features and American cops yabber at each other in the style of Hill Street Blues, this may be for you.
I do.
And that's that.
Sold.
I just can't imagine if that... Can you imagine that coming across the desk of Ed McBain and him reading the Hill Street Blues reference?
Oh, God.
It's probably what gave him the heart attack.
It probably was.
Yeah. I've rarely come across one that's quite so dismissive, really.
Yeah.
it's by and large people are very positive towards this. But like you say, I think Matthew Cody's review in The Guardian more or less sums up my feelings about it. I will go to, I think, Morgan first to come up with a score.
Okay, I mean, I do agree with everything that we've said sort of against it. I think the drug plot is just fairly baffling and really convoluted. And yeah, putting sort of these sort of weird stereotype voices in his character's mouth, it just does seem really weird and wrong too. But there is actually quite a lot of good stuff in there too, which we shouldn't overlook. I don't know, it's not up to recent standards though, is it? I'm going to go in with a score of, let me just consult Kenneth, I'm going to give it 68 police shields.
68 police shields. And I will pass over to Stephen Royston.
Yeah, well, yeah, you know, when I was looking at Kenneth there before he started speaking, I think I was going to be pretty much exactly the same level. Because when I finished it, I thought, you know what, I really enjoyed that. But
me too.
The drugs plot seems to be needlessly complicated. Lots of huffing and puffing about a plot that isn't particularly seem to have any point to it.
Yeah.
You know, you kind of finished all that and you thought, well, so what? You know,
yeah, the police are barely involved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're just not. So it didn't seem to serve any purpose from an enjoyment perspective because you didn't like any of the characters, and the characters that came out on top you barely knew.
Yeah.
But you know, the investigation into the double homicide was engaging, and there's quite a lot of background about the city, which is a common theme in the recent books. So yeah, I think I'll go exactly the same. I was thinking 68 to 70, but yeah, I think it's just shy of a 7 out of 10 kind of effort. So
right, okay.
Decent, but nothing to write home about. I think if you could have swapped, just tightened it up here and there, and you could have had an absolute corker, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one thing to read this in isolation. It's another thing to have read it just after doing Tricks, which was like a first-time read for me, and was like completely... Well, it shot to the top of the Kenneth table, didn't it? So,
yeah, it's about to...
So this, to me, felt like quite a come down. And like I say, some of that sequence, that sort of porn sequences just felt really grotty. And yeah, but then I mentioned some of the other stuff. I liked some of the little set pieces. I'm not mad keen. And who knows if maybe when we get further into, well, the 90s, I might look back on this with different eyes. But I'm only going to give it 50 police shields at the moment because I was not massively keen.
Crikey.
So... that gives us a Kenneth total of 62 police shields. No rounding required this time. 6 out of 10, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's fair enough, I guess.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. Well, with that neatly tucked into Kenneth's filing system, processing away, we will bring this to a close. The next book that we'll be looking at is Vespers from 1990. And we'll also be back with our bonus episode as well, where we will discuss some more nonsense from 1989 and the book covers and all the usual things. So until then, I am going to say goodbye, and Steve-O is going to say it.
Goodbye.
And I'll leave Morgan to offer his usual farewell.
Fare thee well.